What is up, you guys? Today I'm going to show you how you can build search functionality into your applications using Next.js and Prisma. This is one of the most commonly asked questions that I get. A lot of people want to know how to actually build the full stack search feature so they can actually have a text input that a user can type a search query into and send that query to the backend and actually query the database using the search term and then return entities that match this search term. So we're not just going to be looking at the front end, we're actually going to be building an API endpoint that takes in the search string and queries our database. So I'm using Next.js and Prisma. However, this functionality is tech stack agnostic. Obviously, the implementation will change a bit depending on what stack you're using, but the governing logic is the same. So to illustrate what we're going to be building, I am just on twitter.com here. You can pretty much find a text search input on any popular website, but Twitter has a good example. So they have this search input here, and I can literally type anything I want into this input. And when I press enter, you can see that we are returned entities that match that search input. So I typed Elon Musk, we're shown tweets and users and anything that matches that search term. So what happened though at the code level is they took this search string, and you can see that they placed it in the URL here. It says search, and then they have a search query that says Elon Musk. It's URI encoded. Twitter probably has some search API endpoint that took this query in, searched the database. Their search algorithm is probably very sophisticated, but then it essentially takes the search term, finds the matching entities, and returns that to the client, and then renders it on the browser. So that's what we're going to be building. So what I have on the left here is just a bare bones Next.js project set up. I have Prisma installed and configured as well. This video, I'm not going to be covering how to set up the project. It's more of just like an implementation of search. I'll provide the starter code in the description down below. There will be a GitHub repo, so if you want to clone the repo and follow along, feel free to do that. But essentially, what we have here is an empty Next project with Tailwind as well. I'm just going to use Tailwind to style it so it's not super ugly. And then we're going to have a schema that looks like this. So I have defined this schema, this Prisma schema, where we have posts and users, and there is a one-to-many relationship between post and user. So a user can have many posts. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to have an input that takes in a search term, place that in the URL, just like Twitter is doing here, and then send that search term to an API endpoint that we define. And we're going to search across posts and users that match the search term. So let's get right into it. Let's jump over to the app here. Right now, it's just an empty application. And our app is going to be very, very simple. I'll show you what we're going to be building actually. We're essentially just going to have this text input. This is very similar to Twitter. And then I created this dummy data, and I'll provide you in the starter code the dummy data as well. So if you want to seed your database, and then you'll be able to essentially just search in here, and you can see that that's placed in the URL, and entities that match the search term are returned. So that's what we're going to be working on. Very simple app. We basically just have two components, the input and then the parent of the post here, and then the post item. So I'm just in the root layout file here, and I'm just going to add some CSS using Tailwind to make our app look a little bit better. 900 is, the text is going to be Zinc 200. Okay, and then we're just going to have this div. I'm going to place the search input actually is going to be here. It's going to be a global component, so I'm going to put it in the layout component. And we're essentially just going to have this other div that wraps the input as well as the children, which represents the rest of the application. So let's just add some styling here, not to the input, sorry, to this wrapper container. We're just going to make this flex, column, gap 10, item center, and P6 for padding. I'm not really talking about Tailwind in this video, so I'm just kind of blasting through this. This input, we're going to create a separate component for this, but I wanted to show you that that's where it's going to be. It's going to be a global component. Cool, and then on this div here that's wrapping our children, which is going to be the rest of our app, let's just place some basic styling in here. Item center and a full width. Okay, so let's save that. And now let's define this search input. So that's going to be in a new file. So let's create the file, search input.tsx. Okay, so inside of our search input file, let's create this component search input. And we will default export search input, and let's just return an input for now. And then in our layout file, let's bring this component in, as I was saying before. So we'll say search input, import that. And now we can see that input at the top there. However, it is very ugly. So let's make it look nice. I'm kind of using like Spotify inspired styling for this build here. So inside of our search input, I'm just going to copy and paste the placeholder as well as the Tailwind styles here. So that is what that is going to do, the styling here. So inside of this input, the idea is to allow users to type in, obviously, and then put that search term in the URL. And then our other component on our homepage is going to take the search query from the URL and actually send an API request to our search API endpoint, which we will define shortly. Inside of the search input, we're going to need to create some state that is going to represent this typed search query that the user puts in. So let's create some state. We'll call it search query, set search query, use state, and we will initialize it as an empty string. And the value of this input is going to be the search query. And then on change, when the user types a key, we want to update the search query to be the event.target.value. Okay, so now we have a controlled input and we can type into our input there. So Next.js is complaining here. It is saying that we cannot use hooks in a server component, and it's telling us to make this a client component. So if you're not super familiar with Next 13, they have introduced this paradigm of client and server components, and you can only use hooks in client components, and our search input is stateful. We need the useState hook, therefore we should make it a client component. Now we're going to cover the actual, like, how do we communicate with the URL and how do we get this string into the URL, right? I want to type something like this is a search. When I press enter, I want it to appear in the URL. Very similar to, not very similar actually, exactly how Twitter has it with this search, with the query encoded into the URL. So how do we do that? Let's create a function called onSearch. And so what we're actually going to do is wrap this input in a form because we want to, have the user submit this form so they can press enter. I'm just going to add some styling here. We're going to make this flex, justify, center, and we're going to give this a width of 2/3. Okay, and then we're going to give this an onSubmit function. And when we submit this form, we want to call our onSearch function. Okay, now inside of our onSearch function, what do we want to do? We want to take this search query, the current value of the search query, and essentially put it into the URL. Okay, so we're going to say event. Well, I guess this this onSearch function has to take in the event, and this is going to be a React form event. That is the type of this event. And we just want to prevent the default behavior of this event, which is refresh. We don't want to refresh the page, so we're just going to call it event.preventDefault. And now what we want to do is essentially take the search term and add this URI encoding. You'll notice that like the URI encode of the space character is %20, and that is how we can, what we're going to need to do to put it in the URL. Okay, so on search, if I just log the value of the current query, so if I say search query, let's open up the console here. If I press enter, you can see in the console that this is a search is there. And so now we want to essentially URI encode this and add the %20 character into all of these space values here so that we can actually put it in the URL, because we can't just really put this in the URL as it is. That's not valid URL string. Okay, so what we can do is use a JavaScript native function called encode URI and pass it this string value, and it will return to us this encoded URI. So let's see how that works. So we can say const encoded search query is equal to encode URI. I can't type today. Encode URI, and we want to pass this the value of search query. Okay, perfect. Then what we want to do is take this search query. Well, before we do this, let's actually look at what this looks like. Let's take a look here. So now if I press enter, you can see that it added the %20 to all of the spaces there. So now this is valid URL string, and we can put this in the search query of our URL. That's kind of a tongue twister. Okay, so we can do that using the Next router from Next.js. So we're going to need to use the use router hook from Next. So we can say const router is equal to use router. Now you're going to want to make sure this imports from Next navigation, not Next router. Navigation is their new, what's the word for it? It's like their new folder that has the updated router functionality. The router from Next router is different from the new navigation one, and the navigation one is sort of the new routing paradigm that they're introducing. So we're going to use the Next navigation one. Then we want to essentially just take this search string and push it to our URL. So we can just say, we can't just say, well, we don't want to push encoded search query. What we want to do is basically exactly what Twitter's doing here. They're pushing search, and then with this Q query parameter, and then the value of the query parameter is the search term. So the thing we want to push to our URL is going to be the search route, and we want to add a search query parameter Q, and the value of Q is going to be our encoded search query. All right, so let's see what happens when we do this. If I press, or if I say, hey, person, it's going to push that to our URL. So now we can see we have this search, and then question mark Q is equal to hey, person, our encoded search string. Now, our app broke because we don't have a page or a route corresponding to this, this URL. We don't have a search page defined. So we're going to have to do that. So the way routing works, again, we're not going to get too deep into Next.js and how the routing system works, but we kind of have to here. Inside of our app folder, we can create a new folder called search. The names of these folders correspond to your page routes. So we are going to have to create a search page. And inside of our search folder, we can create a page.tsx. And inside of here, we can create a new React component called search page. And then we will export default the search page. In here, let's just for now, so I can show you that this is working, create a div that says search page. Okay. I don't know if I have to rebuild the app. If I save this, okay, there we go. So we are now on the search page, and our input is still there because our input has been placed in the global layout folder, so it's going to be everywhere in our app. Okay, so this is our search page, and this is where we are going to actually take this value from the URI or the URL and query our database, or send it to our API, and our API is going to query our database. Is there anything else we need to do in here? I'm just going to remove this console log. I think that's pretty much it for this component here. Our search input is done, and we can just close this and start working on this search page here. Okay, so how do we get this string from the URL now and use it in JavaScript inside of our component? Next.js has a hook called use search params that allows us to do this. So what we're going to do is create a variable called search, and we're going to say this is equal to use search params, just like this. And this is going to come from Next navigation, and this is going to return essentially the search parameters in the URL. So let's see what this looks like. We'll say search params log the value of search. Again, we're getting that same client component error because we cannot use hooks in a server component. So let's make this page a client side page. And so if I log search params, which is showing up here, you can see it says read only URL search params. So the URL search params is a JavaScript native object that has these properties on it. You can set the value of the search params, you can get them. What we want to do here is get the value of our Q search string, because we need this hey %20 person thing, because that's what we're sending to our API. So we are telling Next.js that we want this search params object, and from this search params object we want to get the value of Q. So how do we do that? Q stands for query, by the way, if I haven't mentioned that already, or if it wasn't obvious. Q is for query, is what I'm guessing. So let's now see how we can do this. We can say const search query is going to be equal to search.get, and we want to get the value of Q, just like this. Okay. Now we're getting TypeScript is automatically optional chaining this, because search may not be defined. It could be null because the use search params hook could technically return null, as you can see here. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to say, I'm going to add a ternary operator here and say if search is truthy, we're going to get the value of Q. If it's not truthy, we're just going to set it as null. Okay, now if I log search query, this is going to be our URI encoded search query. Hello person. Okay, so search, okay, these logs are getting confusing. Yes, so search params is hello person. So it's actually not encoded anymore. You can see that it doesn't have the %20 thing again. You can see that it does not have the encoded %20 for the space character. So the URL we're actually going to send to our endpoint is going to be the encoded URL. So we're going to need to encode the URI again. So what we can do is we can say const encoded search query is equal to encode URI, whoops, and pass in our search query. Now this might get mad, because why isn't TypeScript getting mad here? This expects a string, and this could be null because we said it could be. So what I'm going to do is just add a or statement here that says if search query is truthy, encode the search query. If not, we'll just pass an empty string. When I was coding the demo, TypeScript was freaking out when I was passing in just search query without this or thing. So yeah, not sure why it's not doing it here. Okay. And now we can log the value of this, and you can see that it now has the hello %20 person. This is a search term. Cool. So now how do we send this to our API? What we're going to do is create a search API endpoint and essentially make a GET request to this endpoint. And this GET request is going to contain the value of our encoded search query in the URL. So how do we create a API endpoint? So inside of this pages folder here, when you create a new Next project, it gives you this sort of like hello example API endpoint. We're going to change this to search, because that's the endpoint we're going to be querying is search. I think actually in 13.2 Next.js, if you just install a new application and you use the app directory, it will define your API routes in the app directory. I don't really like, honestly, I don't like the way, it basically just changed the patterns a bit of like these two request and response objects, and I don't want to get too deep into that. But essentially, I prefer this pattern here. Again, this implementation of search is a tech stack agnostic, so I don't want to get too deep into like how to do it with a certain tool. It's more of just like a create an API endpoint, get the query to the endpoint, and then query your database. That's the point we're trying to cover here. So if you are creating a new app using a new Next.js app using the app directory, you will probably see this API folder in your app directory. and you will not see a pages directory. You can do either, do what you see fit. I just created this pages folder at the root of the project, and then I put the API in there. And currently we just have this example hey dude thing that they gave us. I changed it to hey dude. They didn't do that. That'd be kind of cool if they did. But to show you how this works, I have Postman open here. And so let's actually change the name of our API endpoint to search. Again, if you don't know how API routes work in Next.js, any file name that you give in this API folder is going to be an API route. And the API route we're creating is search. So we're going to name it search. Okay. So just to show you that we are reaching this API endpoint, let's add a log here that says add the API. And using Postman, I'm going to send a GET request to this API endpoint. So if I say API search, we're making a GET request here. You can click send, and you can see the response is hey dude. So we're actually hitting this endpoint, and if I go to the console, you'll see at the API being logged there. So this is where we can actually take in that search term and do something with it. And in that case, that something is going to be querying our database. All right, so maybe you're wondering, well, we have this search term in our URL. How do we actually get that when we make the GET request? So what we can do is grab the query parameter from the request object. So the way we can do that is we can destructure the request query object, and we are going to be expecting a value of Q on the request query because that is what we named it here. So I'm just going to alias this as query. And so now if I log the query and I go back to Postman here, if I click send, the query is currently undefined because we don't have a search query in this URI. However, if I do this structure here, like in the browser, if I copy and paste this, and actually I just want this search part, search /API/search. So now you can see Postman is putting the query parameter Q in the value of the search term, and it's our URI encoded string. So now if I send this, you can see now it's like at the API, and the query is being logged as this is a search term, and it's already decoded. So now we have like this string, and it's successfully at our API endpoint, and now we can just simply do our database search. Okay, so I have pre-populated my database with fake data. I have this seed file here that literally just seeds the database with fake posts that I created. I actually used ChatGPT to generate these posts, which is kind of cool. I just have a bunch of fake data in here, and it's randomly just creating data. It picks random values in these arrays, and it just creates fake data. I just wanted to have some data that is actually searchable rather than just, and so I could show you a few examples. So in the starter project, the seed and the data files will be available. So if you clone the project, they will be there, and you can see the database if you wish. So right now, yeah, we're just using Postman to get this GET request and the search term to our backend. We currently don't have a way for our React application to make this GET request. So that is what we're going to do now. So to do this, I'm going to install a library called SWR. It's just a data fetching library that is popular in use with Next.js. Again, not going to be going too much into that. You don't have to use SWR. You can just use the native fetch library if you would like. You can use whatever you want. You can use React query, anything. This is more of just making the GET request. That's all we need to cover. So I'm just going to install SWR. So now inside of this search page here, I'm going to import the use SWR hook from SWR, and I'm going to define a function called fetch posts that is going to take in the search string, or it's going to take in the entire URL. Inside of here, what we're going to do is essentially just use SWR is essentially just a wrapper of the native fetch API in JavaScript. So we can say const response is equal to await fetch. So we're using the native fetch API URL. And this needs to be an asynchronous function if we want to use the await keyword. And I'm just going to add a quick check here that if the response is not okay, we can check the status. We can say throw new error. And we can just put a message in here. Failed to fetch post. Okay. Then the fetch post function, we want to actually return the data that this response receives from our API. And so we can return response.json. Okay, so now that we have that defined, this is the function that we're going to pass to our use SWR hook. The use SWR hook is going to call this function when we tell it to. So to use the use SWR hook, we can say use SWR, and the first argument to this hook is going to be the actual API endpoint that is going to be passed to this function here. The API endpoint we are going to be querying is going to be /API/search, and then we're going to add our Q query string. So $Q is equal to, now the value of Q is going to be this search query. And actually, sorry, it's not the search query. We're going to have to place this underneath because it's going to be our encoded search query. Encoded search query, just like this. And this is the exact same endpoint that we have in Postman here. The SWR hook automatically adds the domain or it prepends the domain to the API endpoint, so we don't have to explicitly type localhost 3000 like we're doing in Postman here. But you can see that this completely matches this. That is what we're doing. So we're making a GET request to this endpoint. Now the use SWR hook returns a few things. It returns data and the error message if it occurs at loading, and a few other things. The things we're interested in right now for this is data and is loading. Is loading is going to be a Boolean that is true if it's currently in the process of being fetched. The second argument we need to pass to our use SWR hook is going to be the actual function that is responsible for fetching this data. And that is going to be our fetch post function. So fetch posts. Okay, so now SWR actually has a way to communicate with our API via fetch posts. Okay, so you can see now that data in the browser is showing message, hey dude. So that is actually coming from our API endpoint, right? If I change this to just a hard-coded array of like posts, if I save this and then I refresh this page, you can see that here is data is this empty array of posts. Cool, so now you're kind of seeing this front-end, back-end communication within Next.js here. We're sending a search term to our API. We're not doing anything with it right now currently, so let's actually use this search query to search the database we're going to search this dummy data that I have created. And we will actually, rather than just return this empty array, we're going to return posts that match this search term. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to add an if statement here. We're going to check first that this request is actually a GET request. That's sort of the pattern to use in the Next.js API. So we're just making sure it's a GET request. And only if it's a GET request, we're going to try a few things. We're not going to, the search API endpoint is not going to support other HTTP methods other than a GET request. So I'm going to add, so I added this try catch block here so that we can handle the error if one occurs. So now what we want to do is take our query string and actually search our post entities in our database. And as I mentioned before, I have seeded the database with a bunch of fake posts, and our search algorithm is going to be simple for this app. All we're going to do is search posts. We're going to search the body of the post as well as the author name of the post. So if you search Elon Musk, we're going to search, has someone in their post mentioned Elon Musk, or does the user string include the search Elon Musk? So what I'm going to do is just import the Prisma client that I have created in the Prisma folder here. Again, that will be in the project starter code if you're interested. So what we can do is create a post variable, and we're going to use our Prisma client to query our post collection. So we can say prisma.post, and we can call the find many function because we want to search all of the posts. Now inside of here is where we're actually going to query all of the post documents and tell Prisma what to return to us. We're telling Prisma we want to find all the posts that match some sort of set of criteria. And the two set of criteria that we want here is we want to check, does the post body contain the search query, or does the author's name contain the search query? So to tell Prisma that that's what we want to do, we can say where. And because we have two conditions here, we're using an or statement, we can use the or keyword. Now this is going to be an array of our two where clauses. The first one is going to be our body. So does our post body contain this query? And we want to set the mode to be insensitive. We don't want to care about case sensitivity here. This is complaining string. Okay, yeah. So one check we're going to add to solve this TypeScript error here is we're just going to make sure that the type of our query is in fact a string. If it's not a string, we don't want to proceed with the querying. We'll just say that it's an invalid request. We'll throw an error. So we'll say if query, or we'll say if type of query does not equal string, we want to throw a new error. Then we just say invalid request. Now in our case, this is always pretty much going to be a string. This is more of just a TypeScript thing we have to implement. The second or statement we want to add is we want to check, does the post author's name contain this query? So we can say author name contain query. Again, we want to make the mode insensitive. And I'm also going to include the author of this post. So every post that's returned, we want to also tell Prisma that we want the associated author. And this is a relational query, because if we look at our database, we have two separate models here, post and user. However, there is a relationship between them so that we know who the post author is. Cool. Now, again, I'm sure Twitter or Spotify or whoever's search algorithms are much more sophisticated than this, but this is the point of this video is not to show you, is not to go too deep into search as an algorithm, more of just like how to implement this in your application. So feel free to enhance this if you want to search other entities. Feel free. Yeah, the sophistication of search could expand infinitely. So for our purposes, this is pretty good. Okay, now we actually have real posts to return, so we can return the post. Inside the catch block here, I'm just going to add a status response of 500, and we can just end the request. So if we are throw an error for any case, whether it's here or inside of Prisma, it will be caught here, and then we'll just tell the client that something bad happened, and we'll respond with a 500. So now we have our front end hooked up to our back end, and we're actually using the search query to query our database using Prisma. So now if I press enter, we have this is a search term in the URL. Now, none of the dummy posts match that search term, I don't think. So that's why we're still getting an empty array. But what if I search for Tesla? Okay, so you can see that here is data. It returned an array of 25. So 25 of these fake posts, let's just open up this one, have that, they satisfy that search. So you can see that the body here of this particular post has Tesla in it. All of them have Tesla in it. Now, again, just to illustrate the data here, I went to ChatGPT and I typed in, can you please generate me, I think there's like 30 fake tweets that sound like they were written by Elon Musk. You might notice that I'm a fan of Elon Musk. I mentioned him quite a bit in my videos. Anyway, yeah, so these are fake posts that I use, so they include a bunch of search terms. So yeah, feel free to use these. Again, they'll be in the starter code. So now we actually have posts being returned to us on our front end in our Next.js app. So now we actually want to render them on the UI. So that's probably the most exciting part. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we want to do is inside of this div here, we want to iterate through all of the posts. So we can say data.post. Now, typically when I'm using SWR, I'll add a generic type here so I know the type of the data coming back. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm not going to worry about that. We know that posts are going to exist on the data if the data is defined. We could have undefined data, as we're seeing in the console here, because the data doesn't exist until that request is complete. We'll handle that in a second though. Well, let's just do it now. We can say if there is no data dot posts, optional chaining so that we don't get an undefined error. We're just going to return null. We don't want to actually go down here until the data is defined and that posts are indeed on this object here. So what we want to do is we want to iterate through all these posts. We can say data.post.map, and we can take each post, and for each one, we want to create some sort of HTML element. For now, let's see post.body. Cool, so you can actually see these showing up. And actually, you know what? I'm just going to add a type here. So the type of data is going to be an object with posts on it. The type of this posts parameter is going to be an array of posts. And what I love about Prisma is that it generates TypeScript types when you create your schema. So we have a type defined. You can import that from the Prisma client. When you generate the Prisma client, it creates a TypeScript type for you, which is amazing. It's one of my favorite features of Prisma. But you'll remember that when we queried the database for post, we also included the author. And so the structure of that Prisma is going to return is going to be the author as well, in addition to the post. And the type of author is going to be user. And again, user can come from our Prisma client folder that Prisma generated. Cool. Okay, so now we actually have auto completion here because we know the structure of our data. So that is how you can implement search. Like, we've already finished the core concept of this application. What I'm going to do is just style this a bit in case you're interested, but we've pretty much completed all of the challenging parts of this app. And now what I'm going to do is just kind of post in the actual HTML body of this post, just to make it look a lot nicer. We're going to add the image, the author image URL. We can import image from next image, save this. So because my fake posts have images from Twitter, this is like the Twitter storage bucket for images. Next.js is freaking out because it's saying you have not actually added this URL to your images configuration in Next.config. So this is this Next.js specific thing. The way to do that, if you're curious, is you can go to your Next.config file here, and inside of this Next.config object, you can add an images object and tell it where images might be coming from. So you're saying you're allowing remote images to come from these URLs. I think I have to rebuild the app to activate those changes. So restart the server there. Okay. So now I should be able to save this, refresh. So I think the reason that this is not centered is because I just have this outer parent div here, which we actually don't need. I'm just gonna make this a fragment. There we go, so that's centered. And one actually improvement we can make to this is in our search input. Where's search input? Search input. Rather than initialize the value of this to be an empty string, we can check if the URL contains a search query and initialize that to be the initial value, or initialize the search query to be that, so that it appears in our URL. So the way we can do that is going to be very similar to how we essentially grabbed the query from the URL in our search page. So I'm just going to copy and paste these two things here and place them here like this. We'll bring in our use search params hook from Next navigation. And we actually don't need this second search query variable here. I'm just going to cut this, and this will be the initial value of this state here. So get rid of this. Okay, yeah, now we're getting that error. I think I mentioned before how TypeScript was freaking out. So here I'm just going to add a or statement like this. Same thing down here in our value, just to satisfy TypeScript. Okay, so now this search term from the URL automatically appears in the input on page reload. So if I visit this URL for the first time, it's automatically placed in the input. We're seeing posts that match the search term Tesla. Let's just do a few more examples here. Let's search for Alexander. Let's just search for Alex. So if I search for Alex, what should happen? Cool, where return posts that the author name or that the author string includes the search term. You can play with this as much as you'd like. If I search for new, these are all the things that include new. Let's do fast. So that is how you can implement search functionality into your Next.js applications. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you like these types of videos. I'm trying to mix in kind of like shorter form content among these like giant build projects. So let me know what you think, or if you have any ideas or things you want to see. Join my Discord. The link is down in the description. Thank you guys so much once again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.